America Societies, where I work, our job is to strengthen that network. And we do that by providing Japan-related program opportunities for our members. We offer public affairs programs, business-related programs with both U.S. companies that have invested in Japan and Japanese companies which have invested in the United States. Just recently, the Japan-America Society of Georgia did a program with AFLAC describing their business in Japan as part of one of those programs. We also offer a cultural program which features the collections of Japanese art in American museums, and the Japan-America Society of Georgia will be offering one of those together with the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. later this year. Tonight's program is called the Geostrategy in the Grassroots series, and it's a partnership between the National Association of Japan-America Societies and the Sasakawa Peace Foundation in Japan. The purpose of the program is to take the kind of geostrategic discussions that we often hear in Washington, D.C., and make them available to people outside of Washington. To do that, for each program, we invite an expert from Japan and an expert from the United States to have a conversation about the geostrategic challenges that both countries face, separately and together, in East Asia. This is the ninth, I should say, of 9 geostrategy programs this year that the Sasakawa Peace Foundation and NAGIS have sponsored at Japan-America Societies. And it's been a wonderful group of experts. The key to these programs is the experts, and they've provided a lot of information and insight on the many different challenges that both countries face. Tonight, we have 2 wonderful experts joining us. Both Murata Sensei and Sheila Smith have appeared at Japan-America Societies in the past, and we are grateful to them for doing that. This is the first time that they've appeared together, so it should be a very interesting discussion, and we look forward to that. We're also grateful to our partner, the Sasakawa Peace Foundation in Japan, and we welcome the many guests tonight. I see we have over 80 attendees now, and we probably will get more. We have attendees from both the United States, Georgia, and from Japan. We welcome you all, and we thank you for your participation. Yoshi, back to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Peter. We really appreciate all the support from the National Association. You all do so much, and making these types of events possible is certainly one of the highlights of our year. So thank you again. But before we get started, just want to kind of very quickly share the Georgia-Japan relations, as we have a lot of people tuning in from Japan, but actually Japan is Georgia's #1 foreign investor. There are over 650 Japanese companies in our state that employ about 37,000 people. And these companies have invested over $11 billion in Georgia's economy. So there's a lot going on between the state of Georgia and Japan. But today, we certainly look forward to learning more about U.S.-Japan as a whole and the small part that Georgia plays in making this bilateral relationship so special. But without further ado, I would like to introduce our 2 guest speakers. We today have Dr. Koji Murata, who is the President Emeritus and Professor of Political Science from Doshisha University in Japan. And also Dr. Sheila Smith, who is a Senior Fellow for Japanese Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations in Washington, D.C. So first, we'd like to start off with Dr. Smith. Sheila, thank you so much for joining us today. We really, really appreciate it, all the way from Washington, D.C. Hopefully you can visit us in person soon. But if you can get us started with an introduction about your insights into geostrategy and what it means to you.
Thank you, Yoshi, and thank you, Peter. It's lovely to be with you, even if I'm virtual. I love the state of Georgia. I've been there many times, and I'm hoping I'll see you all in person sometime soon. But in the meantime, I've been asked to talk a little bit about geostrategy from the U.S. point of view. So what I thought I'd do this evening is talk a little bit about the Biden administration. We've had a very busy couple of weeks here on the Asia front. It will continue to be busy next week, and then a couple of weeks after that, we expect that Prime Minister Suga may pay us a visit. So this is a great time to be looking at Asia and to be thinking about the importance of the U.S.-Japan partnership there. There are a couple of issues too I'd like to highlight in the U.S.-Japan alliance that are really pretty important at the moment, and that it's useful for us to continue to keep in the headlines, so to speak, and our awareness of what's happening. And then finally, there's some difficult issues, I think, that our Japanese and American government officials will be talking about. They're difficult problems, and we may come at them slightly differently at times, but I wanted to share some thoughts on those as well. I also wanted to say we've got a terrific audience. I ran through the list of participants and we've got some real experts on that list, also from Japan. So I hope they will also contribute and speak up during the discussion. So 3 things. Asia Week, what happened? What were they doing? The Biden administration, of course, has now in place a new Secretary of State, a new Secretary of Defense, a new National Security Advisor. There's a new team. They are not new to our colleagues in Tokyo. Many of them, they have served in the Obama administration. These are familiar faces. They're people that know Tokyo, Japan well, know the alliance well. So in some ways, this is a transition that was very familiar, I think, to our colleagues in the Japanese government. But what was interesting to watch them at work in this last week or two was both the way in which the table was set, so to speak, for Asia, the very important place the US and Japan relationship played in that setting, and also the way in which China was not at the center of that setting. And so let me start where the president actually began, which is in the Quad meeting. And it's important here, not just that the Quad meeting came first, but that this was the first leaders meeting. So you had President Biden, of course, virtually still, but meeting with the prime ministers of Japan, India, and Australia for the first time. And what that did, what signal that sent, was that the Quad now is not just an idea or a concept or a kind of on again, off again experiment in cooperation. It's basically sent the signal for all 4 countries that this is the framing within which they want to discuss the future of the region, but also this is the framing with which they would like to pool their strategic resources as they confront the strategic challenge of a rising China. So very strong signal at the beginning. And it's very consistent with how President Biden campaigned, which was he wanted to work with allies and partners. He wanted to work in a collective or coalitional way, not an America go it alone, but this was going to be a new construction of how America teams up with others. And so in Asia, it's very important at the moment. So from the Quad was important for, there's a whole list of things that happened and it came out of that meeting, but a couple of them obviously were COVID-19 related, pandemic related. India will be producing more vaccines. There's an agreement that the 4 countries of the Quad want to make sure that the other countries of Asia have access to vaccines. So there's a strong commitment there, not to just think about ourselves, but to think about the role we play in helping others manage the pandemic. There was also a conversation about more broadly about resilience, and that's both economic resilience and political resilience. Of course, you are all aware that Australia of late has borne the brunt of considerable pressure from Beijing because it took a point of view that China didn't like. And trade tariffs were imposed on Australia for the reason. I think there's an awareness across all 4 countries that there is a need to dull, if you will, the kind of ability of China to put that kind of pressure and to put that kind of economic harm on one of the countries. So there's a pretty strong basis of agreement here that the resilience of the partners, economic resilience of the partners, is a long-term project to consider. And then finally, of course, there's this question of technology and technological innovation, which I think we're going to hear a lot more about from the Quad in the coming years. So let me stop there. The next piece of the Biden Asia Week was the 2+2 in Tokyo. And so our Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense got on an airplane, went to the region, the first overseas trip by the cabinet officials. And they stopped first and foremost, obviously, in Tokyo. We had a very productive meeting with the Japanese Foreign Minister and Minister of Defense. There's a joint statement and a fact sheet, by the way, which I urge you to take a look at. You can see that on the State Department's website if you're interested in the details. But the big piece that stuck out is obviously there was a huge paragraph about China and about China's behavior that was inconsistent with international law, inconsistent with international norms. And so that was a pretty blunt statement that the United States and Japan were pretty much on the same page in terms of looking at the way China has been behaving. And it included a number of basic policies, which were that the US-Japan Security Treaty, Article 5 of that treaty, it continues to extend to the Senkaku Islands in addition to all of the other islands of Japan. So there's a restatement of a fairly high level commitment by the United States to the defense of Japan. But there was also a mention of Taiwan. And that's new. It's not the first time the US and Japan have talked about Taiwan, of course, but as you may be aware, the Chinese military has been fairly active in and around Taiwan of late. And there's been statements coming out of the Chinese government to the effect that they feel a little bit that there may be an opportunity ahead to realize their ambition of bringing Taiwan into the full embrace of the People's Republic of China. So I think there's a lot of sensitivity in the region to what exactly the Chinese are signaling. And so Japan and the United States made very clear that they were watching this with great concern. Xinjiang, human rights issues, the genocide issue that was also discussed. There was such a whole issue of behavioral problems that were discussed given China, vis-a-vis China, that is. So China, it was all about China in Tokyo. The two secretaries then went to the Republic of Korea, in which this joint statement, there was no joint statement, first of all. And second of all, nothing was mentioned about China in public. There was a conversation about China behind closed doors, but the difference in perceptions in Seoul and Tokyo are something we should probably talk about in the discussion. But the focal point of the US conversation with our partners in South Korea was, of course, North Korea and deterrence and denuclearization. We can talk a little bit more about that in a second. From there, it was then the Secretary of State headed to Alaska, the Secretary of Defense headed to India. Again, another piece that doesn't get much play in the headlines, but our defense and strategic relationship with India is getting very considerably deeper. There are some issues, but so too is Japan's strategic relationship with India. So Secretary Austin made his way to New Delhi to talk about how to deepen the India-US strategic partnership. Secretary Blinken, as you know, headed to Alaska to meet with Chinese officials. He was joined there by the National Security Advisor, and we all saw the very feisty public press remarks that were made by senior officials. Some people were very, thought this was terrible. Some people thought it was staged. My own impression is I think there's been a great deal of frustration in Beijing over the last several years because there hasn't been direct engagement really in the day-to-day kind of government conversations that you normally have. The US and China really haven't had much of those of late. And of course, the Chinese have also been feeling their oats, as my grandmother would say. They've been feeling quite that they are more powerful, that they are more prevalent in the region, and that they have they can stand on an equal footing with the United States. And in fact, we're quite critical of the United States. I think this is the China that we should get used to, quite honestly. And I don't say that out of hostility. I just think that we are now looking at a China, especially Xi Jinping's China, that feels increasingly as if it would like to contend with the United States for leadership, certainly in the region and indeed perhaps globally. So we've had a busy week. We will have another round of high-level Asia talks next week when the National Security Advisors of Japan and South Korea and the United States gather in Washington to talk about North Korea. You may have noticed there have been a couple of missiles that have been let loose by the North Koreans. But I think there's been a North Korea policy review underway in Washington by the Biden folks to think about what approach they want to pursue, but most importantly, how to bring allies in Japan and South Korea together for a trilateral understanding of a collective approach. As you know, Japan and South Korea of late have had some pretty serious political tensions, but I think this is a priority. We'll see some of that diplomacy happening next week as well. And then, of course, Prime Minister Suga is set to come for the first state visit for President Biden. And that's a very important signal of the importance of the partnership to this administration. So the dates are being whispered. They haven't officially been announced yet, but we know they are coming, and the cherry blossoms will be gone. Let's just put it that way by the time the Prime Minister arrives. But I expect that you'll have another round of fairly strong conversation between the president and the prime minister about China, and also about how to embrace and move forward the Indo-Pacific agenda. Let me talk about a couple of things, specific issues that I think I would advise you to keep your eye on, so to speak. One is the Senkaku Island. I'm getting a poll. I'm not going to answer my poll. I'll answer it after I speak. I'm not very good at multitasking that way. So the Senkaku Islands, as you know, are the islands that are in the East China Sea, and the Chinese, in addition to putting military pressure on Taiwan, are also have been making a little bit more, their presence has been a little bit more regular and consistent in and around those islands. But the real problem, or the real challenge, I think, is that the Chinese now have announced a new law affecting their Coast Guard, in which the Coast Guard now is allowed to shoot at any foreign vessel in what Chinese waters. And of course, that's, forgive the pun, it's a bit of a shot over the bow for any country with a territorial dispute with China, because now the Coast Guard is going to be given far more latitude to be able to use force against any fishing vessels or any other kind of vessels around islands that China claims. So again, sovereignty doesn't have to be decided, it just has to be claimed for the Coast Guard to be able to act. And that is a problem for Japan. It's a problem for many claimants in the South China Sea as well. So that will be a focal point for the US and Japan to consider. Already the Japanese Coast Guard and Maritime Self-Defense Forces have been exercising to demonstrate to China that they too will be able to use force, either at the level of the Coast Guard for law enforcement, or if necessary by the Maritime Self-Defense Force, if there's a challenge to the sovereignty or the territorial waters of Japan, which obviously includes the Senkakus. So if you close your eyes for a second, I know all of you can imagine Northeast Asia, but think about where the Senkakus are in relation to Taiwan for just a second, just to imagine your geography. For those of you in Japan, that's very easy. For us Americans, it's a little harder. But it's important that you understand that what the Chinese forces are doing in and around Taiwan is actually not all that far away geographically from what's going on in Okinawa. So that whole swath of Japan's southwestern islands leading into Taiwan and further south is now increasingly entangled with an awful lot of Chinese military forces, air and maritime forces. And so there is a conversation underway between the Japanese and US governments about what, if anything, Japan Self-Defense Forces could do should there be some kind of contingency involving a Chinese, either a gray zone or a low-level set of pressures on Taiwan, or even more worrisome, any kind of military action. So keep your eye on the Taiwan space, because I think the alliance is going to be discussing that fairly carefully in the months and years to come. The last piece to watch for, and I would expect this to be a large part of the conversation between the president and prime minister, is the Indo-Pacific. Again, I think, as I mentioned, I see the first week is setting the table for collaborative action, for sharing strategic leverage, for thinking about different ways in which each of those Quad countries can act in concert, but not necessarily always synchronized. And I think there'll be more conversations like this between Japan and the United States. This is not an audience I need to remind that the free and open Indo-Pacific as a strategic concept is a Japanese concept. It's a concept that the Biden administration, since coming into office, has fully embraced. And I think now there's just a question of how do we realize it? How do we build the partnerships? Where do we focus our attention? Which countries do what, when, and how? And I think that I would just caution you to say the Quad is not an alliance. Some people like to call it an Asian NATO, and that's the wrong way, I think, to understand the grouping. It's much more flexible than that, but it'll have technology coordination. It'll have, as you saw in the COVID vaccine, it'll have other kinds of biomedical cooperation. It'll be very focused on resiliency, building resiliency, and making sure to act in concert for the stability of the region. Problem spots, and I'll just add quickly here, so I'm talking too much, I'm sure. It'll be interesting to see next week what the trilateral national security advisors meetings produce in terms of North Korea policy. I think there is some concern in Washington, and I'm really looking forward to Koji's conversation about this, but there's some concern that the political tensions between Seoul and Tokyo have gotten to the point where it could interfere with military cooperation should there be a crisis. So I think there'll be an effort to try to reassure that the trilateral military coordination on North Korea continues to be effective. I think that's going to be a big part of next week's meeting. But the long-term challenge is each of the three countries have a slightly different approach, I think, to negotiations with North Korea. And that's the denuclearization piece. And again, Koji and I can talk about this a little bit more in the discussion, but I'm not sure the Biden administration yet has a policy, but it'll be very, denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula is a phrase that both Secretary Blinken and Secretary Austin have used. And of course, the South Koreans prefer denuclearization. You know, they prefer a different framing. And in reality, if you're a negotiator, those denuclearization of North Korea and denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula mean very different things. So I think there's a lot of space yet to be explored between the three countries in terms of how to proceed on the negotiating side, or how to try to engage Kim Jong-un if he's engageable. And the last piece, I think, where Tokyo and Washington will have to spend a little bit more time coordinating is on Myanmar. As you know, the coup in Burma has produced violence against the citizens of Myanmar. There's a UN Security Council conversation about this. Japan has historically had a very close relationship, or a very effective relationship, I should say, in communicating with the military leaders there. And so that's a channel that Japan wants to explore. I think, you know, should things get a little bit worse and our domestic politics get a little bit more focused on violence against the citizens of Myanmar, then we would have to manage that difference in approach, I think, a little bit better. But let me leave that here. There's no lack of issues for Japan and the United States to work on. And where I have identified differences, they are not differences, I think, that weaken the alliance, but simply just nuances of different styles and approaches to problem solving. So thank you very much. Look forward to the conversation.
Well, thank you, Dr. Smith. I really appreciate it. So Japan Week has become Japan Month, it seems like, and maybe this whole year will be a year of Asia, right? So about Murata Sensei, it's been a big week for the U.S. in terms of U.S.-Japan relations. What's the Japanese perspective of all that's been happening in geostrategy?
Thank you very much. Hello from Japan. My name is Murata. I went to Atlanta just one time, visited the Jimmy Carter Presidential Library. And actually, I met President Carter just one time at the bookstore in Washington, D.C. By the way, already Dr. Smith has provided a very good overview about the U.S.-Japan relationship and geostrategic situation in Asia-Pacific region. So I will just bring you a supplemental Japanese view. First of all, Japanese people were, and probably still are, somehow, among the Japanese people, Mr. Trump was and still is somehow popular, because Mr. Trump took a very tough attitude toward China, and Mr. Trump and our former Prime Minister Abe kept a very good relationship. So some Japanese people were concerned about Mr. Biden's policy toward China, but now a few months has passed, and the Japanese people, I think, are more and more confident about new administration's foreign policy. Mr. Biden makes clear how the Washington pays special attention to the U.S.-Japan alliance, and even Biden administration taking a very tough position to China. I was a bit surprised when President Biden made public apologies about the Japanese Americans during the World War II. I guess this is a sign new administration pays a special attention to the U.S.-Japan relationship, and also new administration is very sensitive to human rights issues. And how the U.S.-Japan alliance is stable under the new leadership of Mr. Biden and Mr. Suga. One important factor is Japanese domestic politics, I would say. And this year, 2021, is a very important year for Japanese domestic politics. As you know, July, we are supposed to host Tokyo Olympics. This is a big event for the Japanese people. And September, the presidential election of LDP, Liberal Democratic Party, governmental party, will be held, whether or not President Suga is re-elected. This is a very important factor. And finally, up to October, general election of the House of Representatives will be held. So this year is a very important for Japanese domestic politics. If Japanese domestic politics become unstable, it's difficult to maintain, sustain sound US-Japan alliance. This is one thing I would like to say. And from a Japanese perspective, at least from my view, Biden administration, inside the Biden administration, there are several groups. One is alliance-oriented people. You know, in Europe, NATO, in Asia, US-Japan alliance and others, the alliance relationship is very important. So Washington tries to re-strengthen alliance relationship all over the world. This is one group, the alliance factor, alliance-oriented people. And the second is human rights-oriented people. Human rights violation cannot be accepted. These people. And the third group is, I would say, environmental people. The most important task the United States is now faced with is a global agenda, such as environment and pandemics. In order to cope with these agendas, environment and pandemics, the United States need to cooperate with China. These three, alliance-oriented, human rights-oriented, and environment-oriented groups. And alliance-oriented groups are very welcome to Japan. And the environment-oriented group, you know, even Japanese government, Prime Minister Suga last October made public, Japan will aim at carbon neutral up to 2050. So in terms of environmental policy, Japanese policy and American policies are getting closer and closer. And even China is seeking decreasing carbon energies. So in terms of environmental issues, Japan, the United States, China may be able to cooperate each other. That's good. And I'm afraid if the US-Japan alliance has some difficulties, the field might be human rights issues. Over the Chinese human rights violations, to what extent Japan can take a tough position? Well, as Dr. Smith pointed out, over the Myanmar issue, to what extent Japanese government position and American government positions are different? This human rights issue might be a bit difficult between Japan and the United States. And the Japanese society, of course, in the United States, you have your own human rights challenges, and our society, you know, gender issues or sexual minority issues and others, we have our own human rights issues. So this is we have to be more and more sensitive about the human rights issues, not only international community, but also our own domestic society. That's the second point. And I would say if Mr. Suga is re-elected as the president of the LDP, the tenure of the president of the LDP is 3 years. So up to September 2024, Mr. Suga might be the president of the LDP, and Mr. Suga might be the prime minister of Japan. So September 2004 means just 2 months later, you have a presidential election there. So in the year of 2024, both Japan and the United States might have the leadership change again. So 2024 might be a very important year for the US-Japan relationship. And beyond 2024, probably around 2028, Chinese GDP will be surpassing to the American GDP. So it means China will become the largest economy in the world. So it will be a big challenge to the international community. But history is somehow ironical. When China becomes the largest economy in the world in 2028 or so on, India's population will surpass Chinese population. So once China becomes the largest economy in the world, China will lose the position of the largest population in the world. So, and Chinese final goal, they always says, is year of 2049. The year of 2049 is centennial anniversary of the establishment of the People's Republic of China. People's Republic of China was established in 1949. So 2049 is a 100 years anniversary. So I would say the year 2028, China will become the largest economy in the world, but the Chinese population is getting smaller and smaller, environmental issue and economic gap and so many problems China will face. So from 2028 to 2049, I would say China is strong. China will be strong, but very vulnerable. Strong but vulnerable is very potentially dangerous. So I would say between 2028 and 2049, it might be a kind of 20 years of crisis of the 21st century. So how to cope with these 20 years of crisis in the 21st century? Japan, the United States, Australia, India should cooperate each other, and we have to expand the cooperation with other countries, in particular Europe and Southeast Asian countries. During the Cold War period, Japan was, of course, ally of the United States, but the Cold War period, Japan was located at kind of a backyard of the Cold War. The front line of the Cold War was Europe. But now, tension between the United States and China, we mean Japan is located at the front line of this confrontation. So Japan's responsibility is much larger, and the Biden administration is emphasizing the importance of the alliance relationship. It means Japan must Japan must expand our roles, missions, and responsibilities. Let me stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Murata-sensei. It seems like this is a very critical time in our history. So there's a lot happening both here in the US and Asia. And so from now, we'll start the panel discussion. But for all of our audience members tuning in, if you have any questions for either Dr. Smith or for Murata-sensei, please use the Q&A button at the button below, and you can ask your questions, and we will have a Q&A session towards the end of the program. But Dr. Smith, so Murata-sensei talked a whole lot about China and kind of the issues coming up from about 2028 till 2049. And this is a critical point in our juncture. With that, can you talk about, I know you wrote a book on this, right? So can you talk about your book? And I know it's been a few years, but what has changed since you wrote that book? And how do you see kind of US-Japan relationship playing kind of the major role in managing the China nuance? We won't say a challenge, I guess, right? But so can you talk a little bit more about that?
So Yoshi, I think you're referring to the book I wrote in 2015 about Japan's domestic politics and a rising China. So the interesting thing about that research for me was, as somebody who had studied Japanese foreign policy for some time, is by the time you got into the early 2000s, you began to feel some real tensions in the relationship. Not the kind of tensions you saw with the island dispute in 2010 or 2012, but there were trade disputes. They were small, but they were irritating. There was problems that just couldn't get solved between the two governments. And so that book is really to chronicle the growing influence that Chinese decision-making, just by stint of being a larger power and a stronger power, how that was beginning to percolate and affect the relationship with Japan. So it's pretty much a deep dive into Japanese domestic politics and more than the Japan-China relationship. But I will say that you know, I had done the research on the Senkaku Islands. I'd gone down to Ishigaki and I talked to fishermen and done all this stuff before the incident happened. So it was very interesting for me that I was, you know, treading in places where there was yet to be a focus. And then all of a sudden it became this very popular dispute to talk about. But I do sense that the challenge today between Japan and China is quantitatively different and qualitatively different than it was in the early 2010s. And by that, I simply mean it's a straight out competition for military capability. And I hear it's not just Japan by itself, it's the US-Japan alliance that is important that we remember, that Japan is not prepared to stand up against China alone, not organized that way. It's not a nuclear power. It has a very significant military, but it is not organized in a way that would be able to contend with China on its own. And the alliance, that the real shifting point, I think, for the alliance was when China began to put military pressure on the Senkakus, on Japanese territory itself. It really alerted policymakers in both Tokyo and Washington that the alliance had largely been organized around the idea that a military conflict would happen somewhere else, most obviously in the Korean Peninsula, or maybe some tensions across the Taiwan Straits, but Japan wouldn't be the first recipient of a use of force incident. And that changed people's minds. It made people alert to the fact that, we haven't prepared for this. So the two governments spent a lot of time trying to understand each other's perception of the problem, but also created what's known as the alliance coordination mechanism. So it was a way to be able to talk to each other before an incident arose to the level of military force. So as crises were building, there was now this formalized mechanism to talk about how to deal with the crisis, perhaps how to avoid the crisis and not allow it to escalate, obviously, to the level of military force. So the alliance is not only militarily much more prepared than it was back then, it's also in policy terms become much closer in terms of coordinating policy, speaking at the highest level of security policy makers in Tokyo. Japan has a new institution, the National Security Secretariat, that looks a little bit like our National Security Council, slightly different, but the same function. So the leaders of those two organizations, our NSC and Japan's NSS, that's who's meeting next week, they now have an ability to talk to each other, whereas before you didn't really have that kind of high-level strategic communication channel. So there's been lots of adaptation since the Senkaku tensions arose. But the reality is we're facing in Taiwan, I think, a similar kind of thing. Here's a problem that we didn't really organize the alliance around. But we may be confronted with it. So how do we deal with it? And I think that's a little bit where we are. So the alliance evolves as challenges present themselves. But I think for us, we're moving into a much more integrated way of thinking about the two militaries in the region, because it is a much bigger problem for us, and it'll be a longer term strategic tension, I think, not just one little incident, but this is a long-term problem that we'll have to formalize our cooperation around a little bit more.
Great, thank you so much. Now, Murata Sensei, going to you, I know we kind of spoke a lot about Taiwan already, and I think we can talk about Taiwan for all night, and I think days and days and weeks ahead too. But so there's a question that came in through the chat box. So if Taiwan and China tensions continue to rise, Murata Sensei, do you foresee the U.S.-Japan alliance stepping in and kind of managing it and being the ally to Taiwan? How do you see that playing out?
Thank you very much. Of course, it is up to scenario what kind of military conflict between China and Taiwan. But if China invades Taiwan using the military forces, certainly the US-Japan alliance must cope with the contingency because, China claims Taiwan is a part of China and Senkaku Island is part of Taiwan. So logically speaking, China says Senkaku is part of Taiwan. So that's why Senkaku is part of China. So if China invades Taiwan, probably they may attack Senkaku Islands. So this is our own territory from a Japanese perspective. So Japan should take some action. But what we can do with the United States should be very carefully and pragmatically coordinated. It takes a long time, I guess.
Great, thank you very much. And then Dr. Smith, kind of going back to you, we had another question through the chat box. Now, you talked about the Quad Do you think the Quad will formalize a military alliance sometime in the near future, you think, or is just kind of an ongoing discussions? And I guess, as Murata-sensei said, I guess it all depends on the scenario of different things happening throughout the East Asia.
So I don't see a formal alliance a la NATO, for example, being in the mix. I think two things. One is, historically, if we think about it, our alliances were formed in the wake of World War II. They were formed to contend early on with the early shift towards the Cold War tensions between the United States and the former Soviet Union. Today, I don't see you have that kind of dynamic at play. So what I think you see is primarily the four countries coming together out of concern for a free and open maritime transit and transport. So you see, United States, of course, has done freedom of navigation operations, which is what we do to dispute people's claims, right, in maritime areas. But what we've been doing with Quad partners, and this goes back to the United States and India, and then Japan joined in the trilateral exercises. These are referred to as the Malabar Exercises. The three navies get together and they exercise in different parts of that large swath of Indo-Pacific, right? So the Indian Navy has exercised with the Japanese and American navies on the East Asia. Likewise, the American and Japanese navies have operated with the Indian Navy in South Asia and the Indian Ocean. Australia has more recently joined, so there's been all four Quad navies have now exercised together this past year. So I think you're going to see that, and these are largely presence operations. These are not combat operations. They're not designed to intimidate anybody, but they're designed to demonstrate interest in making sure that the sea lanes that everybody depends on so heavily remain open and free. So I think you'll see missions like that, where the militaries may come together to be able to demonstrate presence or demonstrate interest. But I don't think you're going to get each country promising to defend the other or use force on somebody else's behalf.
Certainly. Murata Sensei, going back to kind of more domestic issues with Japan, you spoke that this year is a big year for elections. And in the US, the last year was a big year, and actually Georgia was the forefront of it last year and this year. But do you see foreign policy and US-Japan relationship playing a big role in this year's election at all? And how do you see Prime Minister Suga's relationship with President Biden moving forward?
Okay, thank you very much. As Dr. Shira pointed out, our Prime Minister is supposed to visit Washington, D.C. So if US-Japan summit meeting is successful, it will help supporting rate of Mr. Suga, that's one thing. And Prime Minister Abe and President Trump kept a very good personal relationship. And this personal ties helped the US-Japan alliance, not only the US-Japan alliance, but also, I guess, global cooperation, because Mr. Trump did not have a good relationship with, for example, German Chancellor Merkel and French President Macron. But Mr. Abe kept a good relationship with both Mr. Trump and Chancellor Merkel and President Macron. And so I guess Mr. Abe did a very good job. And Suga-Biden relationship, we do not know yet. So, but I would say they are in the same generations. Both Mr. Suga and Mr. Biden in the age of 70s, and both Mr. Suga and Biden supported younger superiors for a long time. For Mr. Biden, President Obama for 8 years, and Mr. Suga as the chief cabinet secretary, he supported the younger Prime Minister Abe almost 8 years. And both Mr. Suga and Mr. Biden are very pragmatic, well-experienced politicians, and both of them put the environmental issue is a very high policy priorities. And President Biden, after President Reagan, he is the first American president who did not graduate from Ivy League, either undergraduate or graduate. And Mr. Suga, he was the first LDP president and Japanese prime minister whose family background was not politician since Prime Minister Kai-fu. So we can see a lot of similarity between the two leadership.
Great, thank you very much. Speaking of Prime Minister Kai-fu, he was the last Prime Minister to visit Atlanta. And yeah, so it's been a while. So hopefully Prime Minister Suga can visit us sometime soon too. So, well, Dr. Smith, kind of going back to you, we have a lot of security questions for you, it seems like, and appropriately, I think. But we have a question from the audience. So I guess the U.S.'s America's refusal to sell the F-22 Raptor to Japan was officially prohibited due to protect its technology. Was that the actual case, or was it an olive branch to China? If the latter, what's the impact on that increased U.S.-China tensions? That's a difficult one, but yes.
No, it's actually pretty straightforward, but that's an interesting perception of the decision that it was about China. It wasn't about China at all. It was about protecting American technological advantage. So we, our Pentagon developed certain systems, and you know, they don't want to let them out until they are no longer the premier system. And so the F-22 wasn't just the Japanese that wanted the F-22, the Israelis and others wanted it as well. So there were significant concerns about the F-22, what it would do to regional balances of power. So maybe that's the perception behind your question, but it wasn't out of a concession to China by any means. It was more about our technology protection.
Okay.
One little footnote, if you don't mind, Yoshi, on the, since you've got people interested in fighter jets.
Please.
Something to watch here, and this comes out of the Trump administration's approach on the F-35, is that the F-35 sale to Japan, which is 104 jets off the shelf, are produced in the United States off the factory lines here. And that was to help President Trump with his promise to create American jobs. But what it did was it shut down a production line in Japan for fighter jet production. And so the close support fighter that is Japan desperately needs, that next generation fighter, is now going to be built in Japan. And Mitsubishi Heavy will be the lead contractor on a global coalition of tech companies for that. So that's a new dimension of US-Japan military technology cooperation, and one in which the Japanese manufacturer is going to take the lead.
Wonderful. That's great to hear. That goes both ways, right? So, but yes. Well, Murata Sensei, you and Dr. Smith both talked about Myanmar. Do you see Japan having a specific role to play in the resolution of the crisis in Myanmar right now?
Well, as Dr. Smith pointed out, Japanese government has kept somehow close ties with Myanmar, even during the period the United States took economic sanction against Myanmar. So I would say we have a kind of a special relationship with the Myanmar establishment. So Japan should utilize this special relationship with the Myanmar establishment. And some say that if we push too hard to Myanmar, Myanmar military may go to China closely. So it is dangerous. So I do not know whether or not it is true, but we have to utilize our human networks with Myanmar. Slightly different from the United States.
Great, thank you. Dr. Smith, back to you, and then we'll try to get off the security questions too much, but how important is it, you think, is for the Quad to align their cybersecurity and internet regulation policies to be able to counter China's sway within the APAC region and beyond?
So there's a couple of ways. One is the cyber piece, which is more the kind of state security offensive kind of capabilities. And I don't know, there's some experts in the participants group who might be better positioned than I to comment on this. But so the cyber capabilities, the hard thing about cyber capabilities is that they are the leading edge often is private sector. Is not necessarily state, and the state mobilizes cyber capabilities, of course, in a very sophisticated way for specific sophisticated purpose. But in our democracies, our private sector also has a pretty tremendous set of capabilities, and they don't always get marshaled by the state. But I think therein lies a kind of there's a tension with cyber, that it's not pure state action, right? And it includes a whole host of other actors. But where I think, to answer your question about the Quad, where I think the Quad is going to be very, very critical is in developing clear rules on digital behavior, right? And by that is, both litigating cyber crime, which is what we do when somebody, attacks a Sony or something else. It's a criminal act, right? So aligning our legal responsibility to prosecute cybercrime will be very important. The second is just general commercial digital rules of the game. And that was part of the puzzle that was addressed in the bilateral trade agreement between the United States and Japan under the Trump administration. And therein lies a very interesting model for replication. We are not any moment now about to dive in or return to or negotiate an entry into the CPTPP. For those of you who really wish we would, I wish the politics were different in this country, but I don't hold your breath there. But there is some smaller focal points on the trade side. And I think particularly for the Quad, this piece of the digital rules of the game could be very, very important. And it would include not only how to sell and buy and trade digitally, but it would also include a pretty important conversation on privacy protections and other kinds of liberal values that we would like to make sure that are protected across these societies. So I think there's lots of room there, not necessarily just on the cyber criminal side, but on the construction of a set of global rules that could begin with the Quad countries.
Great, thank you very much. So Murata-sensei, kind of talking about geostrategy, what are some of the key things that you think Japan can learn from the US, and some things that the US should learn from Japan as well?
Very good question. I would say, looking into American domestic society, now you have several, kind of, what shall I say, divided lines, Democrats, Republicans, or several ethnic differences, and socio-economic differences, gaps between rich people and poor people, and so many other differences in the society. And even Japan, now 2.3% of residents in Japan are non-Japanese, and the year of 2050, about 10% of residents in Japan will be non-Japanese. So, I mean, Japanese society will be more and more diversified. Then we will also experience socio-economic differences and some kind of conflicts between different ethnicities, the gap between riches and poor, and these kind of things. So in this sense, what the United States has experienced, we have to learn a lot for our stabilizing our society. If the society is not stabilized, you cannot play important roles in a geostrategy. That's one thing we have to learn from the United States. And the other thing, the opposite, what you can learn from Japan, maybe Japan has cultivated very sound relationship with Southeast Asian countries through official development aids and others, and exchanges of human networks, including Myanmar. So this kind of multilateral cooperation, the United States is the superpower. So superpower tend to be occasionally unilateral, but Japan is not a superpower. So we are very familiar with the kind of multilateral cooperation. So this might be learned from Japan by the United States.
Great. Both great points, I think. Dr. Smith, anything to add to that from your perspective, what we can learn from Japan and what Japan can learn from the US?
Oh, I think Koji did a really nice job there. I would not want to try to add to that. I would just say one piece on the geostrategy side, which is because I sit in Washington, I can feel it quite strongly, and especially in the last 4 years in the last administration, I think there was a tendency to rely very heavily on American power as hard power, our military power, our um, and what I'd like to do, our material power, hard economic power, that kind of thing. And I think what Japan has offered us in the Indo-Pacific, the free and open Indo-Pacific concept, but just writ large, Japanese diplomacy brings a lot of different levers to the table, both economic in terms of aid and support, but also there are very few diplomats as sophisticated in the application of diplomacy as Japanese diplomats are, and I think we have to up our game a lot. And that means for the United States, I'm not saying our diplomats are not sophisticated, so please don't misunderstand me here. I'm just saying the comprehensive use of the various levers that Japan can adroitly bring to a problem. I think we have a lot to learn there, and I think that offers us a great example, particularly now as we try to re-engage with partners in the Indo-Pacific.
Great, thank you very much. And my next question is to both of you, actually. So we talked about very high level, political alliances, security issues, even trade a little bit too. What does kind of the grassroots component have on, I think, geostrategy, the people-to-people relationship, the Japan-American societies, the international chambers of commerce locally and at the state level, in different prefectures and regions in Japan, community and organizations? What type of role do they play, I guess, in the U.S.-Japan alliance? And that, let's go with Murata Sensei first.
Thank you very much. One example, when Mr. Trump declared the United States withdraw from the Paris Accord, then he said that I was elected by the people from Pittsburgh. I was not elected by people of Paris. Then soon after that, the mayor of Pittsburgh says that the city of Pittsburgh will observe Paris Accords. That's a very clear case. Even the central government refuses the international corporations. Municipalities or states can promote global cooperation over environmental, human rights issues, and other issues. So, of course, central government to central government relationship is essentially important. So, but we have to supplement our bilateral or multilateral relationship with non-governmental relations. So, city to city or state to prefecture and person to person relationship is getting more and more important in the more globalized international community. Thank you very much.
So Yoshi, I have to say that I'm the chair of the U.S. panel of the Commission on Educational and Cultural Exchange in the United States and Japan. So people-to-people exchange is geostrategy is one thing, but without people, we don't have a relationship. And so I think it's so important, and we've been spending an awful lot of time thinking about our next generation. The younger generation of who are going to be the stewards of the U.S.-Japan partnership. And I think it's very important. And I think sometimes I have conversations and my Japanese colleagues say, yes, we need another Mike Green, or we need another Sheila Smith, or we need another Koji Murata. And I said, no. What you need is the next generation of Yoshidomotos and others around the country who are going to sustain the citizen-to-citizen relationship, because without it, we could have a security treaty on paper, but without the confidence of the American people in their friends and partners in Japan, and the confidence of the Japanese people and the people of the United States, that piece of paper has no meaning, right? But I do think it's also important that we note that this is the 10th anniversary of the Great East Japan earthquake of 2011, and we've come off a couple of weeks of commemorating that big event. Both of our countries have had moments of crisis. when the other country, not just the militaries and the governments, but the people of each other's countries have come to the rescue, so to speak, of their friends. And that was exactly the same thing that happened to us after 9/11. Of course, Prime Minister Koizumi made a statement of Japanese support for us at that time of great difficulty, but the Japanese people did as well. So I think the people-to-people relationship is the U.S.-Japan partnership, and the diplomats and the strategic thinkers are important pieces of it. But without all of you out there in Atlanta, Georgia, and other sister cities around Japan, and the students that go back and forth and learn each other's languages and build lifelong friendships, like my host family, we wouldn't have the relationship we have today. And that's a deep friendship and respect for each other across the Pacific.
May I point one more thing?
Yes, please.
Yeah, in the United States, you know, mayors of the city or governor of the state might become a secretary, cabinet members, or president suddenly. So for Japan, state relationship with the United States is very important, pragmatically.
Very true. You never know who will be on the cabinet, right? So better take care of the people-to-people relationship. And certainly with the pandemic, in a way, it's been easier to connect with people online, virtually, but we all certainly cannot wait until we can resume our exchanges in person, whether that be student exchanges, professional exchanges, and cultural exchanges too. So, but before we finish up this evening, I have one question for both of you is, if people want to learn more about the U.S.-Japan relationship, the alliance, I know you have both written books, done extensive research, and you have a very active blog, I believe. So where can people learn more about your work and kind of learn about kind of the future of U.S.-Japan relationship? Dr. Smith, you first.
Thank you. Well, I sit in an institution called the Council on Foreign Relations. We have a website, cfr.org, where you can not only learn about Japan and you can find my writing and my work, but you can find a host of foreign policy issues that affect the United States being discussed. We have an interactive on that website on Japan's constitutional debate, which has gotten a lot of nice feedback from educators and media alike. So there's that. I did mention KOCON and the Japan-US Friendship Commission. They have a website as well. It's www.j-_usfc.org. And on there, we have a new portal called Nichibe Connect, which is dedicated to providing information on scholarships, on internships, Japanese companies looking to hire young Americans across the country. And then we're beginning to do interviews with people who are established in the field, so young people can go and see how people develop their careers. Paige Cottingham-Streeter is the executive director of that, and I just posted my interview the other day. So it's a nice portal for younger people interested in the partnership to go and see where they might find jobs and opportunities and meet mentors.
Great, thank you. Murata Sensei, how about you? Where can we learn more about your research and your work?
Well, I'm very old-fashioned person, and I would say that many Japanese used to learn about the United States or American society from American TV dramas and American films. So I would encourage younger Americans to understand Japan and Japanese society through, for example, manga, anime, and Japanese films. There will be a lot of fun.
Great and entertaining, right? So thank you very much. And certainly you can check out the Japan American Society of Georgia's website at jasgeorgia.org for all the things happening statewide and regionally. The NAJAS website, us-japan.org for things happening nationally. And there are so many other Japanese and American organizations too. So certainly everyone tuning in, we encourage you all to visit your local US-Japan organizations and community groups to keep this conversation going. But at this time, I would like to ask the chair of the Japan American Society of Georgia, Mr. Al Hodge, for some closing remarks and to take us out.
Well, first, thank you to all of the participants. Thank you, panelists, for your participation this evening. What great insight. And as Peter Kelly, our partner with the National Association of Japan American Societies, said early on, every year we say this is an important time. And he added, And yes, every year is an important time, and it seems that this one is even more so. I'm also very encouraged by the positive and upbeat opportunities that we heard this evening between Japan and the United States, while still being challenged. We're up to that challenge, both governmentally, and then of course, it's about relationships, and that people to people, prefecture to state, business to business, and our various associations and organizations such as the Japan America Society of Georgia. We are so very encouraged. Thank you also, of course, to the Sasakawa Peace Foundation. We look forward to even more educational opportunities like this, building upon relationships and an information base. When you talked about defense early on in this dialogue and the trade of military equipment, yes, it's all related, isn't it? Whether it's pure public policy, whether it's mutual interest in education, mutual interest in defense from adversaries, it's also very important. And it is critical that we be well informed and then do something about it. Murata-san, sensei, mentioned Pittsburgh along the way. Dr. Smith was smiling warmly as that illustration was provided. Dr. Smith, thank you again for the role that you play professionally. And we look forward to the updated version of your book, as well as your blogs. Well, on behalf of all the members of the Japan America Society of Georgia, which includes business and sister city relationships and universities, colleges, HBCUs, startups, and so many more, we thank you. And we look forward to even more Japanese investment in Georgia. And of course, Georgia companies and US companies investing in Japan. On behalf of all of us, we thank you.